No one in the hospital corridor noticed her at first. Not the doctors rushing past with charts in their hands. Not the patients waiting quietly behind thin curtains. Not even the security guard scrolling on his phone near the entrance. She stood behind the nurse's station, typing slowly, carefully, her movements precise, almost invisible. The silent nurse. That's what people had started calling her. She rarely spoke. Not because she didn't understand. Not because she wasn't capable. She simply didn't talk unless absolutely necessary. And in a place filled with constant noise, machines beeping, voices echoing, stretchers rolling, her silence made her stand out. That was why they noticed her. 3 men stood near the desk, laughing loudly while waiting for clearance to enter a restricted ward. Construction contractors, confident and impatient, wearing bright vests and heavy boots that echoed with every step. One of them glanced at her and smirked. "Does she even work here?" he whispered, loud enough for others to hear. The others laughed. "She hasn't said a word in 20 minutes. Another added, "Maybe she's scared." Their voices bounced down the hallway. A few patients looked over nervously. A junior nurse hesitated, then turned away. The silent nurse kept typing. She didn't look up, didn't argue, didn't respond. That only made it worse. "Hey," one of the men called out, snapping his fingers in front of her face. "Are you broken, or just ignoring us?" Louder again. Something about the moment felt wrong. Not loud wrong, not explosive, quiet wrong. The kind of discomfort that settles in your chest when you know someone has crossed a line, but no one steps in. The nurse's fingers paused briefly above the keyboard, just for a second, then she continued typing. Her shoulders remained steady, but her eyes reflected something deeper, exhaustion, perhaps, or memory. No one knew her story. No one knew that weeks earlier she had survived something that nearly took her voice from her forever. No one knew that silence was not weakness. It was survival. The men continued laughing, until the elevator at the far end of the corridor let out a soft chime. Ding. The doors slid open. A tall figure stepped out. Black jacket, calm posture, eyes focused forward. Steven Seagal. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush. He simply stopped walking. And for reasons no one could explain, the laughter faded. The air felt heavier. One of the men glanced over his shoulder. "Who's that?" he muttered. Steven looked toward the nurse's desk, toward the silent nurse, and then he spoke quietly but clearly. "Is there a problem here?" The corridor fell completely silent. Have you ever seen someone mocked for being quiet, only to realize later that silence was hiding unimaginable strength? The hospital returned to its rhythm. Monitors continued their steady beeping. A stretcher rolled past, wheels squeaking faintly. Somewhere down the corridor, a child cried before being gently calmed. Life didn't stop, it never does in places like this. The silent nurse stood behind the desk, shoulders straight, posture professional, her badge catching the harsh fluorescent light. Name Amina Rahman, Department Emergency Care. Most people didn't know her name. They just knew she was quiet. Amina had learned early that hospitals weren't just places of healing, they were places of pressure. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone was afraid of something. Fear made people impatient. Impatience made people cruel. So she kept her words measured, minimal, safe. She communicated with nods, short sentences when required, soft confirmations typed into the system instead of spoken aloud. Some colleagues respected her for it. Others whispered, "She's strange, too serious. Why become a nurse if you won't talk?" They didn't know that her silence wasn't a personality. It was a scar. Months earlier, during a late night shift, Amina had been caught in the aftermath of a violent incident brought into the ER. Chaos, shouting, panic, a moment so overwhelming that her voice simply disappeared. Doctors called it trauma-induced aphonia. She could speak, but when fear rose, her throat locked. Silence became her shield. And tonight she was tired. She had already worked 10 hours without a proper break. Her feet ached, her eyes burned. But she stayed focused, double-checking patient charts, making sure every medication time was accurate. Because mistakes in hospitals cost lives. The men near the desk shifted impatiently. "How long does clearance take?" One of them snapped. Amina typed calmly and slid the screen slightly toward him. "No, I turn for my eye on 4 I to my ninja." 4 minutes. "You serious?" She nodded. He leaned closer. "Can't you hurry it up?" She typed again. "Swastam kudareld. Manmanal." The man scoffed and turned to his friends. "Told you. She doesn't talk." Laughter followed. Amina felt it, that familiar tightening in her chest. The warning sign. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She reminded herself why she was here. Not for approval, not for comfort. for patience. Across the corridor, Steven Seagal stood silently watching. He hadn't intervened yet. Not because he didn't care, but because he was observing. Years of training had taught him something important. You learn more about people by watching how they behave when they think no one important is paying attention, and these men thought exactly that. One of them leaned across the desk again. "What's your problem anyway?" he said. "You think you're better than us." Amina didn't answer. He chuckled. "Figures." Steven's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in assessment. He noticed how Amina never raised her head, how her hands trembled just barely, how she still continued working despite the humiliation. That wasn't weakness. That was discipline. A senior doctor passed by, slowed for a moment, then kept walking. The hallway chose silence. Steven felt something shift inside him, not rage but disappointment. Too many people waiting for someone else to act. The elevator doors behind him closed softly. The corridor seemed narrower now. The men were growing bolder. One of them tapped the desk loudly. "Earth to nurse." That was when Steven stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressive. One calm step, then another. His shoes made almost no sound, yet somehow everyone noticed. He stopped beside the desk, close enough that the men finally acknowledged him. Amina sensed movement and looked up briefly. Their eyes met. His expression was steady, reassuring, the kind that said, "You're not alone." He turned toward the men and spoke in a voice low enough that it didn't echo, but strong enough that it didn't need to. "You're in a hospital," he said. "People here are fighting for their lives." The men fell quiet. Steven continued calmly, "And you're laughing. No accusation. Just truth." For the first time all night, the balance of the room shifted. Not because someone shouted, but because someone finally stood where silence had been abused. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The corridor felt unnaturally quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. The men glanced at one another, unsure how to respond. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not in a place where everyone else had avoided eye contact and walked away. One of them scoffed. "Relax," he said. "We're just joking." Steven didn't move. Joking, the word hung in the air. He glanced briefly toward the nurse's station. Amina stood frozen behind the desk, eyes lowered again, hands clasped together tightly enough that her knuckles had turned pale. Steven looked back at the man. "Jokes don't leave people shaking," he replied calmly. The man shifted his weight. His confidence wavered, but only for a second. Then pride stepped in. "You some kind of manager or something?" he asked. "Because if not, mind your business." A few weak laughs followed from his friends. Steven didn't raise his voice. "I am minding my business," he said. "When disrespect becomes public, so does responsibility." That answer confused them. People like these understood shouting threats, posturing. They didn't understand composure. The man rolled his eyes and leaned back against the counter. "Listen, hero," he said. "She doesn't even care. Look at her." Amina's breath caught. Her fingers trembled again, just slightly, Steven noticed. He stepped half a pace closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, simply present. "You don't get to decide what she feels," he said. Another contractor muttered, "This guy's serious." The first man smirked. "Maybe she likes the attention." That was when something changed. Not in Steven's posture, not in his expression, but in the energy around him. The calm sharpened. Steven inhaled slowly through his nose. "Say that again," he said. The man laughed loudly now, trying to reclaim control. "You heard me." Several nurses had stopped walking. A patient in a wheelchair stared openly. Even the security guard finally looked up from his phone. The moment had reached that dangerous point, the one where disrespect either ends or becomes something else. Amina felt it too. Her chest tightened. The familiar pressure crept up her throat like a rising wall. She tried to speak. Nothing came out. Her eyes watered, not from fear of the men, but from frustration with herself. She hated this part. Steven noticed her struggle immediately. He turned slightly toward her. "You don't need to say anything," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. The tension in her shoulders loosened a fraction. Then Steven faced the men again. "You're mistaking her silence," he said, "for permission." The lead contractor stepped forward, puffing his chest. "And you're mistaking yourself for someone important." He jabbed a finger toward Steven's chest. "You don't even work here." Steven looked down at the finger, then back up at the man. "I don't need to," he replied. The man scoffed and looked around for support. "See, this is what happens when you let people play hero." No one laughed this time, because now everyone could feel it. The man was no longer joking. He was trying to dominate, trying to prove something, Steven remained unmoved. "I'm going to ask you once," he said. "Lower your voice. Step back. And show respect." The contractor leaned closer instead. "What if I don't?" The corridor was silent enough to hear the distant hum of machines through the walls. Steven's eyes never left his. Then this moment becomes something you won't enjoy remembering. Still calm, still controlled. The man hesitated. Fear flickered briefly across his face. But again, pride crushed it. He bumped Steven's shoulder intentionally as he passed. A sharp inhale rippled through the hallway. Amina gasped quietly. That contact, small but deliberate, changed everything. Steven took one slow step back, not retreat positioning. He placed himself directly between the men and the nurse's station. A shield, not a threat. "You don't touch people," Steven said evenly. The contractor laughed nervously.
Or what?
Steven didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and calmly removed a visitor badge. He placed it on the counter where everyone could see. Espacial tient, espatial bard. The laughter died instantly. Faces changed. Color drained. The man swallowed. You could have just said that." Steven shook his head. "No," he replied, "because respect shouldn't depend on authority." Security footsteps echoed at the far end of the hall. But Steven didn't look back. His focus remained steady. "You judged her because she was quiet," he said. "You mocked her because you thought she had no power." He paused. "That's not confidence. That's cruelty." The men stood frozen. Amina finally lifted her head. For the first time all night, she wasn't invisible. And the confrontation was far from over. The corridor no longer felt like a hospital hallway. It felt like a courtroom. Everyone stood still, the contractors, the nurses, even the patients who should have been resting. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the quiet hum of medical machines filled the space. Steven remained between the men and the nurse's station, his stance calm but unbreakable. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Protective. Amina stood behind him, hands clasped tightly together. Her breathing was shallow now, not from fear of the men, but from the memories their laughter had awakened. Months earlier, she had worked the same shift, same hallway, same lights. The emergency doors had burst open just after midnight. Paramedics rushed in with a young woman covered in blood. Her husband followed behind, screaming, demanding answers, blaming everyone. The ER flooded with noise. Doctors shouting orders, monitors screaming warnings, fear bouncing off every wall. Amina had been the first nurse to reach the patient. She remembered the man's eyes, wild, broken, desperate. When the woman went into cardiac arrest, something inside him snapped. He grabbed Amina's arm, hard. She tried to speak, tried to call for help, but the words caught in her throat. He screamed at her, accusing her, shaking her. Security arrived seconds later, but the damage was done. Her voice vanished that night. Doctors said it might return. Therapists said it would take time. But trauma doesn't run on schedules. Since then, whenever tension rose, whenever men raised their voices, her throat locked. Silence became her armor. Back in the present, Amina's hands trembled. Steven sensed it. He turned slightly toward her, not enough to expose her, just enough so she could see his face. "You're safe," he said quietly. Not publicly. Just for her. The words landed gently. Around them, the contractors shifted uncomfortably. The bravado they had arrived with was gone. One of them cleared his throat. "Look, man, we didn't know." Steven's eyes remained steady. "That's the point," he replied. "You didn't bother to know." A senior nurse finally stepped forward. "She's one of our best," the woman said softly. "She saved more lives than most people in this building." Amina blinked in surprise. No one had ever said that out loud before. Another staff member nodded. "She stays late, covers shifts, never complains." The hallway slowly filled with quiet agreement. Steven spoke again. "Strength isn't loud," he said, "and healing doesn't always look heroic." He gestured gently toward Amina. "Sometimes it looks like showing up every day, even when your voice hasn't returned yet." The men stared at the floor. For the first time, shame replaced arrogance. Steven turned to the lead contractor. "You laughed because silence made you uncomfortable," he said. "But silence doesn't mean empty. It means something happened." The man swallowed hard. "I didn't think," he muttered. Steven nodded once. "Most people don't." Then he asked something unexpected. "Would you like to apologize?" The contractor hesitated. Pride fought with guilt.
Finally, he turned toward the desk. "Sorry?"
he said quietly. "I shouldn't have said those things." Amina looked up. Her heart pounded. Every instinct told her to stay silent. But something felt different now. The room wasn't hostile anymore. It was waiting. She opened her mouth. At first, Nothing. Then a sound, barely above a whisper. The words were fragile, unsteady, but they were hers. A hush fell over the hallway. Steven didn't react, didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply nodded as if to say that was enough. Amina exhaled shakily. For the first time in months, her silence hadn't protected her. Her courage had. Security finally arrived, but the tension had already dissolved. The contractors were escorted away without resistance. Not because they were forced, but because they understood. Steven turned to leave. Amina called out softly, "Sir." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. Steven looked back. "You didn't need saving," he replied. "You just needed someone to stand beside you." As he walked toward the elevator, the corridor slowly returned to life. Machines beeped again. Footsteps resumed. The hospital breathed. But something had changed. Because that night, silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It had been recognized for what it truly was: survival. Let me ask you something. If you saw someone being mocked for staying quiet, would you defend them? Or would you wait for someone else to speak up? The hallway didn't return to normal right away. Even after the contractors were escorted out, people lingered, nurses pretending to organize charts, doctors pausing longer than necessary, patients peeking from behind curtains. Something important had happened. Not loud, not violent, but powerful enough to stay in the air. Amina sat at the desk, her hands resting still on the keyboard. Her heart was still racing, but beneath the fear was something unfamiliar. Relief. For months, every shift had felt like walking through fog, doing her job well but feeling unseen. Tonight, for the first time, people looked at her differently. Not with curiosity, with respect. A senior physician approached the desk. "I heard what happened," he said gently. "You handled yourself with professionalism." Amina nodded, unsure what to say. Steven Seagal stood speaking quietly with hospital security. He didn't demand punishments, didn't raise complaints. He simply explained what he had witnessed, and that was enough. The incident report would be filed. The contractors' access badges were revoked. Their company would be contacted by the hospital board in the morning. Consequences, not revenge. That mattered to Steven, because accountability teaches more than humiliation ever could. As he prepared to leave, a young medical resident approached him nervously. "Sir, thank you," she said. "People usually don't step in." Steven gave a faint smile. "They should," he replied. The elevator doors opened again. But before he stepped inside, Amina spoke. "Wait." Her voice was still soft, but steadier than before. Steven turned. "I wanted to say I didn't think I could speak again," she admitted quietly. "Not when people raise their voices." Steven nodded slowly. "Your voice didn't disappear," he said. "It was protecting you." The doors closed behind him. The hospital night continued, but word spread fast. By dawn, staff on every floor knew what had happened. Not because of gossip, but because people needed to talk about it. A nurse who didn't speak had finally been heard. Later that morning, Amina arrived for her next shift. She expected things to feel awkward. Instead, something else happened. People greeted her. "Good morning, Amina," by name. A small thing, yet it nearly brought her to tears. During rounds, a patient reached for her hand. "Thank you for being kind," the elderly woman whispered, "even when you don't say much." Amina smiled. Later that afternoon, the hospital administrator requested to see her. Her heart raced again. Had she done something wrong? But when she entered the office, the administrator stood and offered her a chair. "I reviewed your file," he said. "Your evaluations are outstanding." He slid a document across the desk. "A recommendation. Trauma support training sponsorship. Fully funded. We want you to continue healing," he said. "And we want you to stay with us." Amina stared at the paper. For the first time since losing her voice, her future felt open again. Meanwhile, the contractors faced consequences of their own. Their company issued formal apologies. Mandatory sensitivity training was assigned. Access to the hospital permanently revoked. The video, recorded quietly by a visitor at the end of the hall, began circulating online, not showing humiliation, not showing shouting, only one moment. Steven standing calmly between mockery and silence. The internet reacted quickly. This is what real strength looks like. Protecting without violence. Respect costs nothing. The clip spread not because of fame, but because people were tired of cruelty going unchecked. And somewhere in the comments, thousands noticed the nurse. Not her silence, her dignity. Amina watched the video once. Only once, then she closed it. She didn't want to be known for what happened to her. The walls were the same, but she inhaled slowly, then spoke softly but clearly into the empty hallway. I'm still here. Not as a declaration, as a promise. The hospital corridor was quiet now, but the tension remained. Even after the contractors were gone and the night staff resumed their duties, a charged energy lingered in the air. Somewhere between exhaustion and relief, people felt it something important had happened here. Something bigger than any single person. Steven Seagal remained a silent figure near the nurses' station. His presence wasn't loud, but it filled the space entirely. Every movement, every breath was deliberate, calm, controlled. And then, a sudden commotion came from the stairwell. A new group of visitors, construction workers from a different company, entered the hallway. One of them, oblivious to the earlier confrontation, laughed loudly. His voice bounced off the walls, sharp and intrusive.
Hey, did you see that?
Some nurse crying over nothing, he joked, unaware of the atmosphere he had walked into. Amina froze. Her hands tightened around the edge of the counter. Her throat clenched, her heart raced. Steven noticed instantly. He didn't yell. He didn't charge. He walked slowly toward the man. Each step measured, each motion deliberate. The laughter stopped the second the man looked up and saw him. Steven's eyes locked with his, calm but unwavering. You think this is funny? Steven asked quietly. His voice carried authority without threat. The man's bravado wavered.
It's just a joke, man. Is it?
Steven said, tilting his head slightly. Because it doesn't look like a joke to anyone who understands respect. The man tried to step back, but his friends crowded behind him, unsure what to do. Steven remained composed. No yelling, no threats, just presence. You have a choice. Steven continued. Walk away now, apologize, and this ends. Or continue and face consequences of your own actions. The man's friends whispered to one another. Fear flickered across their faces. Pride tried to hold them up. The corridor had gone completely silent. Even the hum of monitors seemed distant. At that moment, Amina felt something shift inside her. The fear she had carried all night, the doubt, the humiliation, the helplessness, it began to dissolve. Steven was protecting her, not with violence, not with rage, but with control, and it was powerful. The man scoffed and attempted a sarcastic laugh. Or what? Steven's gaze never wavered. His hand moved slightly, not to strike, but to subtly block the man's path, demonstrating control over the situation without needing aggression. You still have time, Steven said softly. Choose respect over arrogance. The man hesitated. Sweat formed along his temple. For a fleeting moment he looked ready to push forward, but then reality struck. The audience around him, the staff, the patients, the other visitors were watching, and no one was laughing. The man's pride faltered, replaced with unease. Steven took one slow step closer. The calm authority in his posture was undeniable. You don't need to be violent to be powerful. Steven continued. You just need to understand boundaries. The man's voice faltered. I am sorry, he muttered. His friends nodded, backing him away from the nurse's station. Amina exhaled deeply. Her chest loosened. She felt relief flood through her. Steven turned toward her, giving a subtle nod. Are you okay? He asked softly. Yes, she whispered, her voice steadier than before. The corridor slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of the moment lingered. By the time security arrived to escort the men out, the confrontation had already ended. Not with violence, not with chaos, but with clarity, authority, and respect. The corridor had witnessed something rare, strength without aggression, control without rage, protection without harm. Amina glanced at Steven as he prepared to leave. Thank you, she said softly. You didn't need saving, he replied. You just needed someone to ensure they couldn't take advantage of your silence. And with that, he walked toward the elevator. The doors closed behind him, leaving the hospital staff, and Amina with a lesson far louder than any shouting could ever be. If you were standing there, watching someone being mocked and disrespected, would you have the courage to step in like Steven did, or would you stay silent and hope someone else acts? The hospital corridor slowly returned to life. Monitors beeped steadily. Footsteps echoed again. Voices resumed their usual chatter, but something had changed. Not the walls, not the fluorescent lights, not the stretchers rolling past. Something had changed in the people who worked there. Amina returned to her desk, hands resting lightly on the keyboard. Her chest rose and fell with quiet relief. For months, silence had been her shield. Tonight it had become her strength. Staff stopped by, not to whisper, Not to poke fun, but to offer recognition. You handled yourself amazingly, a senior nurse said. Thank you, Amina whispered. Her voice was still soft, but it carried weight now. The junior resident smiled at her. You've inspired all of us tonight. Even the security guard, who had been scrolling on his phone minutes earlier, nodded in quiet acknowledgement. By morning, the story had begun to spread, not through official channels, but by people who had witnessed it firsthand. Someone had recorded the interaction on their phone. The video went viral online. Not for shouting, not for violence, not for a dramatic fight, but for the lesson it carried. A calm man standing between cruelty and innocence. A nurse who didn't speak yet commanded respect. People shared the video with captions like, "Real strength doesn't shout. Power isn't loud. It's protective." Sometimes the bravest thing is staying calm. Even outside the hospital, viewers paused and reflected. Thousands commented, applauded, and debated. Because it wasn't just a story about a hospital. It was a story about human decency. About how some of the strongest people in a room don't need to prove themselves with words or force. They simply act with integrity. Amina herself watched the video once, only once. She didn't want attention. She didn't want fame. She wanted acknowledgement for what had truly mattered, being treated with respect and standing firm, even when others thought she wouldn't. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues she had never spoken to before. Your courage tonight, incredible. We all learned from you. Thank you for showing us what real professionalism looks like. Her eyes filled with tears, but not from pain, from pride. From understanding that silence can speak louder than words, and the lesson extended beyond the hospital walls. Because everywhere the video went, people recognized the same truth. The strongest person in the room is not the one who yells the loudest. It's the one who protects without losing control. The one who stands firm when everyone else hesitates. The one who doesn't seek vengeance, but ensures accountability. Steven Seagal didn't need to fight. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to humiliate anyone. All he did was stand as a shield, allowing justice and dignity to be restored naturally. That night, people witnessed something rare: power without chaos, authority without anger, courage without aggression. And it left an echo that spread far beyond the walls of a hospital.